Aloha, welcome to Think Tech Hawaii's Education Movers, Shakers, and Reformers, interviews with people who have special insights into education from preschool through adult education. This is our 30th show on Movers, Shakers, and Reformers, a terrific package of insights from principals to all kinds of people. Our special guest today, our cap show, is the investigative reporter for Civil Beat in Hawaii, Jessica Terrell. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I always begin with, tell me a little bit about your educational background.
Sure. So I grew up traveling all over the country. I was actually born in Mexico and grew up all over the U.S., so I was homeschooled most of the time.
Homeschooled?
Yeah, so I mean, you might think it's either a little ironic that I cover education, or in some ways maybe it's a little bit of a boon, because everything, when I started out covering education at least, so much of it was new to me that I sort of had a fresh set of, why does it work this way? But I went to public school for a little while in New Orleans and also New York City. And then went to community college at Long Beach City College before transferring to Cal State Fullerton to study communications with what was an emphasis in print journalism. It's pretty outdated now, but yeah, so that's kind of the background on education.
So you grew up in a musical family, which is why you were traveling around?
Yeah, we were a traveling family jazz band. Yeah, so we moved around a lot.
And so I want to ask you a little bit about the arts in particular.
Sure.
But what you said earlier, you were homeschooled.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about what that experience was like, the challenges, the advantages, whatever.
Well, my mom was really big into education. She had her bachelor's degree in education. And there were a lot of kids. I was the youngest of 8, 6 of us that grew up together. So we did a lot of correspondence school for a while, so that she had a curriculum that we could follow. I think one of the biggest challenges for her probably was fulfilling all of the requirements for every new state that we were in terms of making sure we were registered and following a curriculum and taking, some states require you to take tests, others don't. I think for us, it offered a great deal of flexibility. I mean, I think at the time, I probably thought her education ideas were pretty out there, though now that I'm covering education, I'm hearing people talk about project-based learning and being hands-on and a lot of the things that she was really doing with us back then. So I think there was a great amount of advantage in some ways. Socialization, and there were some things that fell through the cracks. You know, I did a little bit of catch up on math when I got to college that proved a little challenging.
So you traveled to you saw a lot of states as you grew up, and a lot of subcultures and school systems.
Yep. Mexico and Europe for a while, traveling as well, and then a lot of the States, And depending on where we were, we would go and we would participate in some things at the local school.
So you were preparing to be a print journalist.
By the time I was in school, I knew I wasn't probably going to be a print journalist for long, but unfortunately, they hadn't really caught up the program yet. And I'd be curious to see now if Cal State Fullerton, I know they're no longer calling it print journalism, but I'm not sure how much they've sort of caught fully up with the times yet. I mean, I got I felt like I got a good solid foundation in education, but there was, when I entered the journalism industry, a little bit of, why have I never heard of computer-assisted reporting or database reporting, or some things that I think schools like UH are now starting to teach, but maybe weren't.
So you entered the world of journalism when print is almost on the ropes. And tell us a little bit about those experiences with print journalism and that kind of journalistic environment. And were you reporting on education initially?
No. So when I was at Cal State Fullerton, I was an intern with the politics and investigation team at the Orange County Register, which is a pretty big print newspaper in California, a newsroom of a couple hundred. A little different from our staff at Civil Beat, which I think we're at 6 or 7 reporters. And then I went to DC for a couple months and covered the congressional Orange County's congressional delegation there. And then I was a community reporter. So I did some education covering as a part of communities in Orange County and then in New York City. And then I went full-time to K-12 education out in Orange County.
Okay, so Orange County is a big county in a big state. Right? Yeah. That must be a very daunting challenge to know what to look at when there's so much to look at.
Well, I was lucky that I was part of a bigger team. So the education team at the Register, we had an investigative reporter, Melody Peterson, who's now at the LA Times, and she's brilliant, and a very long time investigative and education editor. So someone who'd covered education for 16 years or something, a long time, and then another K-12 reporter and a higher ed reporter. So there was a nice big team to kind of help me dip in. But it was a bit of a challenge because Orange County has 28 school districts.
School districts,
Yes.
not schools, but school
districts, yeah.
Yes.
So you think about a lot of what I covered often had to do with finances, how the school districts were recovering from the recession. And that often required every quarter getting financial reports from 28 different districts and compiling them and then comparing.
Someone sort of teach you or train you of how to analyze finances in a special way? Because that's something a lot of people don't know how to do.
So you get a lot of training on the job. I found it's a lot of journalism, and I mean it's part of why I like being a journalist. Is you always have to learn something new. So I'm an education reporter, but I would say that I'm a continually being educated reporter. So I'm often doing research and trying to figure out what exactly it is that I'm talking about, and that's when folks like you are so helpful.
So did you cover preschool, K-12, higher ed?
K-12.
K-12.
Yeah.
And so how long did you do that?
I was 2013 and 2014.
And that's kind of coming out of the recession. What were the big kind of trends and big issues that you saw in California?
In California, finances were, I mean, it was an enormous issue because a lot of school districts were really grappling with that. And I think even our biggest district was dealing with, like, their bond rating was getting downgraded. There were a lot of school bond issues that were being covered in terms of districts getting into agreements that would end up costing them so much down the road, but didn't quite realize that. Common Core, obviously, was just districts were starting to figure out what was going on with that. And then right before I left, the lawsuit, I think it's going to take me a minute to remember the exact name of it, Vergara, I think, v. California, which was about the unions. And that was a big thing and probably will continue to be a big thing, I think, as they sort that out.
So that environment has many different layers compared to Hawaii. I mean, you have districts that have responsibility, often through property taxes to fund their schools. So
it's a very different funding mechanism.
So let's talk a little bit about what drew you to Hawaii from this big, environment of lots of districts and lots of bonds and whatever to a single school district out here in the Pacific.
Well, Civil Beat, for one. I took a buyout from the Register because they were making some pretty big cuts to their education team. Was kind of looking for what the next opportunity would be. And while I had been at the Register in the last 2 years, they'd really been reinvesting in print, and there'd been this sort of opportunity to be a little insulated from the pressures of I wouldn't say sensationalist journalism, but trying to make sure that you're getting a certain number of clicks and some of the pressures that come from it today. And so I think first of it was Civil Beat, which offered me an opportunity to kind of focus on some important issues. And then I think at Civil Beat, we like to look at Hawaii as not just having very interesting issues here, but being an interesting place to explore many national issues because we are sort of a little isolated out here. It is a sort of interesting laboratory, right, for looking at some of the bigger issues through what we're doing here.
So covering K-12 in California, you also have federal issues, federal government issues and whatnot. Lots of organizations and whatnot. Talk a little bit about finding the right sources in general for education.
Finding the right sources. Do you mean in terms of testing their credibility, or?
No, I mean web sources, data sources, policy groups.
Yeah.
Both you and your predecessor often have links to all these studies and groups that a lot of people never even heard of. I mean, is there a way of for a new journalist to sort out where you go for all this stuff?
Well, there are some organizations that help. So there's an Education Writers Association.
An Education Writers Association.
Yep, they have a national conference every year. I went to one year in California. And they do a lot of curating, and they will also be a resource. So it's a good place to go to see what other people are talking about in the country in education. I'm not sure how Aaliyah would have, how she got her sources before.
We're talking about Aaliyah Wong, your predecessor at Civil Beat.
Who's now at The Atlantic as the education editor, I believe. I look at what other people are talking about, and then there are some bigger national think tanks and organizations that seem to weigh into policy. And once you start talking to them, you ask them who they would talk to, and you kind of just start developing.
You have your own bibliography of links.
Yeah, you start developing a bit of a network.
Yeah. So anyway, you're drawn to Hawaii, and you've been here about a year.
A little less than a year, yeah.
What are some of the salient, other than size, differences that you see between the mainland educational world and Hawaii?
It's really hard to talk about it without talking about size because it impacts so many other things. Having one school district versus 28 provides some advantages and then some challenges in terms of coverage. And that sort of trickles down into everything else, I think, in terms of who parents reach out to, how local school board meetings happen or don't when you're on a neighboring island. The finances are vastly different from how most school districts handle it. So the size is a really big one, and it kind of plays into everything that I cover and all the information that I try and get. I think some of the challenges probably for here, data is a little bit harder to get. It doesn't mean the data
is harder to get, even though it's a smaller
in Hawaii.
Yes.
Yeah. California, they do a lot of even though you're talking about a lot of school districts, the state still provides a really comprehensive look where you can go and you can pull up just about any statistic you could imagine on the school or district level. And some of that data is tracked here in Hawaii still, and it's just a little bit harder to find, or you have to request it. And then other data, it seems just sort of difficult to get, or it's not tracked. So, for example, when we covered sex education earlier this year, I couldn't get information on which curriculum each school or each complex area was teaching because it's just not tracked. So I'm not saying that's definitely something that there would have been information on in California, but I think that's just one of the challenges in terms of data tracking. It's not quite as easy.
Okay, well, we're talking with Jessica Terrell, the investigative education reporter for Civil Beat. We'll be back in 1 minute.
Mahalo for watching Think Tech Hawaii. We are a channel dedicated to raising public awareness about the importance of technology, energy, diversification, and globalism to the future of Hawaii. We broadcast and stream daily from 1 to 5 every weekday, and we broadcast on Olelo 54 and OC16 TV. All of our shows are archived on thinktechhawaii.com, and we hope to see you there. Aloha.
Aloha! Hello, my name is Patrick Bratton. I'm host of Global Connections here at Think Tech Hawaii. We broadcast live every Thursday at 1 p.m. We bring Hawaii to the world and the world to Hawaii, talking about international events and various things of interest to the audience. Please join me. I look forward to talking with you and having you get to meet some of my guests. Aloha.
Aloha! Please join the Hawaii Farmers Series every Thursday on Think Tech. We live stream from 4 p.m. to 5 p.m. and we are
Matthew Johnson and Justine Spiritu as your hosts.
And the purpose of the Hawaii Farmers Series is to get to know our local agriculture community a lot more, get their backgrounds, get their history, find out why they love what they do, as well as get some of their insights.
And insights into hearing about the future of agriculture in Hawaii.
So we're going to bring the experts on, but we'd also like you to be a part of the conversation. So you can always join us by tweeting in your questions and comment at ThinkTechHigh. So we hope to engage with you. Thanks.
Welcome back to Education Movers, Shakers, and Reformers. We're talking with Jessica Terrell from Civil Beat, and you were talking a little bit about the differences between your journalistic life on the mainland, California, and Hawaii. And you mentioned data and the website. Mm-hmm. Talk a little bit about the importance of a website and tracking data for whether it's you or anybody else trying to follow education.
Sure. So the DOE in Hawaii does put a lot of information online, but there's a ton of information that schools track, and not all of it is put online, some for privacy reasons and others. But finding the data can still be a little bit of a challenge, or requesting it. It's not quite as simple of a setup, I think we mentioned, as California or some other states. And it's important because it's a critical source, I think, for looking at how we're doing. And I'm not talking just about test scores, because I think we can talk about that later, but there's some good pushback for a reason against test scores. But attendance, health, I mean, there's so many different things that you can look at with education data that really do tell bigger picture stories.
And that's not there or very hard to find compared to the California website?
Compared to other websites, yeah. So again, the DOE does put a lot up there, and I think they've made improvements in recent years from what I've heard. But it took a bit of adjusting, because I'm used to being able to go to the California website and pull down a lot of things that are a bit harder to track or that have to be requested here.
How about just negotiating the logic of the website? How do you find our DOE website in terms of finding what is there?
Gotcha. I mean, it's hard to compare because I'm comparing it to 28 plus a state website. Yeah. I think it's gotten better. I think the Strive High website seems pretty easy to navigate for parents who are looking for that information. But yeah, I think data in general in Hawaii, not just at the Department of Education, but in general in government, is an area where I know there's a lot of interest in improving access and making it easier to find, but when you compare it to some other states, we're not quite there.
Do you think it's a matter of resources or attitude or policy or practice?
I think maybe all of it. It's hard to tell. I think some people are more interested in it than others. I wonder how much the turnover of employees in Hawaii has an impact on things like this. The DOE's main data guy, I think Dave Moyer, I believe he recently left. I think he'd been here for a couple of years. And I know that putting more resources online and trying to maybe even figure out ways to get high school students involved in figuring out, here's this data, how can you create an app with it that will be useful for your fellow students? Some ideas like that were things that he'd really been into, but now that he's gone, will someone else pick that up? I don't know. And I know that turnover is such an issue for teachers. It just makes me wonder in other areas, how much of an impact turnover has.
So a week in the life of Jessica Terrell, thinking about California, but also now thinking about here, what does that look like that's similar and maybe different in covering K-12?
A week in the life really isn't necessarily different here than it would be in California. I mean, I think we're still looking at a lot of the same issues. It's just that instead of maybe rounding up sources from 28 districts, I'm talking to one, or trying to persuade someone to talk to me in one district when they might be a little more reluctant to, just because there's nowhere else for them to go if there is a problem, if there is a backlash for that. But day to day, we try to make sure that we're focusing on one sort of enterprise story every week. So something that's not just what news is breaking and coming in. And
so when you say one enterprise, you're talking about more of a long-term, persistent issue compared to the crisis of the day?
Yeah, so something beyond breaking news, something that kind of takes a look at a trend or an issue and maybe goes a little more in depth, and is something that we're choosing to look at because we think it's important. Yeah.
So looking at K-12, where do you see in Hawaii trends that are worth, oh, I better keep track of this one or that one, that you see where our DOE has been, where they are, where they're going, that hasn't really been that well understood?
That hasn't been that well understood.
In other words, without saying what you're going to report next, what are you going to report next?
Nice, I like that. You know, in the coming year, I mean, because I'm still new to the education beat, a lot of what I'm looking at is questions that I have for myself as I approach the beat.
Okay.
So how well is the DOE doing when it comes to meeting the needs of various groups of students? How transparent is it? How accessible is it to parents? So I'm taking those sort of very broad and basic questions that you'd go for everywhere, and then trying to look at them through a lens here. I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff happening with Hawaiian education, and I think there's a lot that maybe still hasn't been covered with that, but I think some really interesting and innovative and different things are happening there. I don't expect too much to change because of No Child Left Behind, but I'll be curious. I think in the next year, seeing what happens with the union's very ambitious and broad education proposal. So those are a few of the things that I'm keeping an eye on.
What grabs you about the HSTA, the Teachers Association agenda in particular? Anything that, oh, I really need to hone in on this, or that is not well understood, or whatever?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the first thing that grabs me about it is just how big it is, right? I mean, it's so broad. If it was passed,
700 million here or there, right?
Well, I mean, everyone's focusing on the tax, I think for good reason, because I mean, that's obviously the most dramatic, or you know, it would have the most impact on everyone in the state. But if you look at the proposals, they really want a very broad change to how education is done here. And I think some of those deserve a little more attention. Special ed and the time allocation for each teacher that they would have for the, depending on the need of that student, as opposed to just the number of students. The time that's spent on the arts, you know.
As a musician, you have an interest in that.
Well, they say that music helps with, you know, developing math skills, though personally I'm not sure that that's true for me, not for everyone.
But particularly
there are
instrumental music wires the brain in a different way.
So I think that the proposal deserves attention beyond just the tax raise in terms of why teachers really feel there need to be some very broad changes to education here.
So you have this big agenda coming into the legislative session, which starts in a couple of weeks, right? And you have the budgets coming in, right? As you look at K-12 education, what you mentioned some of the questions you ask. It sounds like you're asking the questions that any member of the general public would tend to ask about public ed.
Mhm.
Is that a...
Yeah, I think so. I mean, when you're writing for education, I like to think about who we're writing for. So we're writing for parents, right? For the parents of the consumers of the education. We're watching out for taxpayers. And then, as sort of the fourth estate, we're trying to keep an eye on issues of equity and fairness and things that maybe the general public might not be interested in, but policymakers should have an interest in. So I think they are general questions that the public might ask, but then we kind of try to delve into those using data, using different sources to really hone in on how we're doing and where there are areas that are problems.
In recent years, there's been an exit of reporters becoming communication directors for government, right? So I'm assuming that you're talking to people who are former journalists and trying to get some information out of them as well.
Many times, yes. And I think it can be a good thing and a challenging thing as well. Because I think a good communications person who was a former journalist has a better understanding of where you're coming from in terms of deadlines and still has, a sense of wanting to be open. But they're sort of playing for the other side now, so there is a, not adversarial, but, it's an interesting relationship. And one of the people that I worked with at the Register for a long time switched from covering education to being on the PR side of things. And it was interesting because now that they're sitting in the closed session board meetings, they told me that it's shocking to them how many things really do come up that, in the newsroom, we always sat there and wondered, is this something that they're really talking about in closed session or what really happens?
Are they care? Do they know?
Yeah, or, what decisions are really being made behind closed doors, and now he's on the other, that person's on the other side of it, and they can see that, but now their job is to not to sort of, expose what those decisions are being made. So,
do you find that journalists in general who go to the other side are good at communicating with the public, better at it? Is there a journalistic skill that makes them really good at telling the story?
I mean, I would think from the way that they get recruited, the answer would be yes.
But you said I would think that.
Well, I mean, I can't make a generalization for everyone. Most of the PR people that I work with have a background in journalism. So I'd have to sit and think kind of pretty hard to think of PR people that I've worked with that weren't journalists at one point or another. So I think that says they definitely come away with the skills to do that.
Do you find that the former reporters are the keepers of a lot of data, or like they have to go look for it too internally?
They have to go look for it too.
So they're not sitting on the computer with all this data and shall I give her this or that and that. They have to dig it out. They're still being journalists in some respects.
There's still, I think you're right. I think there's still a reporting aspect to it where they have to find the information. The question then, of course, is once they have the information, do they want to give that to you or not? And that, I think, is a little bit different of a question.
And do they call you up and harass you if they don't like your story?
It happens.
It happens?
It happens. I mean, that's their job, and I understand that. And, I try to, my pitch when I go in and try and make relationships with new PR people or anyone in general is that I'm tough, but I'm fair, and I want you to know that a story is coming. If it's negative, you'll know that it's coming and have a chance to respond. But I'm not going to change what I'm going to report because you don't like it.
So they're not going to give you a press release. In the old days, you just repeated that as in some journalists did. You're going to take that and say, where does this go? Back and forth and dig deeper.
Yeah, I mean, it depends. It does. And when you say in the old days, I think that still happens a lot now. And I'm not talking specific to Hawaii, but just in general. I mean, you're blogging. At a certain point, when I was at the Register, the sort of request from the editors was 3 to 5 stories a day.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yep, and some of those could be small, some of those could be short blogs, but 3 to 5 stories a day, you get a press release, And if it's something that's, simple as saying a program starting, you're probably going to take that, type up something short and put it out there.
Okay, well, we're talking with Jessica Terrell, journalism in Hawaii, covering education. We'll be back in 1 minute.
Hi everybody, I'm IC Davidson. Thanks for watching Think Tech Hawaii. One of the things that we try to do here is promote civic engagement. How do we do that? We put on shows weekdays from 12 to 5 p.m. We let people in our world on Facebook and all the social media. Today I'd like to talk to you about another way that you can engage us here at Think Tech Hawaii and help us promote civic engagement here in Hawaii. What you do is you get on Twitter, you follow us at Think Tech HI, and during the day, between weekdays between 12 and 5 p.m., you can interact with each of our live shows. What does that mean? You can send us questions, comments, thoughts, experiences, anything. All you have to do is mention us on Twitter. We'll see it here in the studio, and our hosts and guests will address them accordingly. This is a big thing for us. We want to hear from you. The conversation doesn't start here when our show ends. It ends when everybody gets their say. Join us weekdays, 12 to 5 p.m. on thinktechhawaii.com. Join in the conversations live with Twitter, at ThinkTechHI. Thank you for watching. We appreciate your support. See you soon.
Welcome back to Think Tech Hawaii's Education Movers, Shakers, Reformers. We're talking about how to be an investigative reporter for education with Jessica Terrell of Civil Beat, an online entity that has entered our journalistic world here. And you had mentioned that you had covered K-12 before, but now you're also responsible for the University of Hawaii.
Yeah.
First impressions of trying to cover the university.
Sure, absolutely. One quick thing before I go to the first impressions,
right.
just to finish responding to the question about press releases, that's where data comes in for me. So, and that's what we try to do at Civil Beat in terms of getting the press release and then looking for the data to see what the story is beyond that. First impressions of UH, yeah, I covered K-12 education. I was on 2 different college newspapers for 4 years, so that's pretty much and it's a different experience covering it as a college journalist. There's a lot to cover at UH because UH is the only, there's one university system here, one flagship campus. I think they have the sense that we maybe pick on them a little bit, or that they get a lot of extra attention, not necessarily from Civil Beat, but from the media, because they're the one show in town. But I mean, it's an interesting place to report on, and I think now that TMT is settling down a little bit for the moment, there'll be a lot more stories, not just from Civil Beat, but probably other news organizations on UH.
On UH. What, as you look at UH now, what do you see the emerging stories that have not been well told for the public?
Gotcha. Well, I mean, I think one of the recent stories that we did was really talking about registration and trying to improve graduation rates. And I think there's some really interesting things to talk about in terms of how UH is trying to change that or meet that at community colleges and in general. But I think the question of how well are our universities preparing people for careers and for what's going to be coming in the future, I think, is something that we maybe need to delve into a little bit more. I talked to some folks in the last week or two who I think raised some interesting points about how college education maybe hasn't really evolved or changed from, it's the same complaint that we hear about K-12, right? That you're having people sit in a classroom and, writing notes and doing things that maybe don't equate to what they're going to be doing there, and needing to make things more hands-on. So I think maybe a little more exploring of that is something I might do.
K-12 is known by reputation as being very conservative in terms of changing. Do you find the university worlds changing much more rapidly, and I mean in their businesses and in how they have to attract people rather than kids just showing up at the door?
Yeah. I don't think I don't think necessarily that universities change much faster
Okay.
than K-12 does. And I would say that K-12 has gone through an enormous number of reforms in recent years.
Sure.
The question, of course, is, are those reforms the ones that, testing reform is one thing, but are we doing, I think some big education thinkers would say, are we doing the reforms that, really transform education, make it something very different? But my sense is often, faculty can be set in their ways, just the way that school teachers or administrators can be. And it's an enormous system. The idea of creating change in a system that big would seem daunting to anyone, I think.
Now, we have a Board of Education and we have a Board of Regents. Can you talk a little bit about covering them, talking to them? They have a sunshine law that governs them. What that looks like of learning about, analyzing, and reporting on those governing boards.
Gotcha. So I haven't done enough Board of Regents coverage, honestly. I mean, most of my coverage so far has been much more K-12 centric, I think, simply because that was one of the easiest things to dive into. And I think you sort of expect, in some ways, college students and their families to be a little bit more, they have some more choices than you do for maybe elementary school or high school. So K-12 was more of a priority coming in. The Board of Education, and this is one of the areas that it's also different from California, they're trying to be more transparent. They're broadcasting audio of their stories, their meetings now at least. But compared to some other, Santa Ana Unified, for example, was one of the districts that I covered in California, and the meetings are streamed. They're put on so you can watch them at any time. You can click on an agenda item and it'll take you just to that, so parents can maybe see a little bit more of what's happening. And because the Board of Educations tend to be a little bit smaller, I think they're a little bit more accessible as well. So it's difficult to get an interview with some of the Board of Education members here in Hawaii.
I see.
You put in a request, and once in a while someone will respond, and there are a couple who are more open to talking than others. But even going and trying to approach them at a meeting, I think there's it's a little less expected than maybe it would be at a certain Board of Education meeting in California.
So tracking down and talking with these very influential people is a real challenge for you.
It can be a challenge, yes.
Yeah.
Like I said, some are more open to talking than others. Some are okay with you reaching out to them directly, but I have gotten some emails saying, why did you reach out to this person directly? It needs to be funneled through. And
they don't want you to talk directly to an appointed member of the Board of Education.
Not always, yeah. So
we have an appointed board. It used to be elected. Do you have any comments on who's on that board and just observing their knowledge and interest? Are they just as overwhelmed as anybody else by the enormity of their task?
They don't seem overwhelmed by the enormity of their task, but one of the things that I'm curious about is when you have the board and it's here and meeting in Honolulu, how much do they really know about what's going on a more micro level on neighboring islands and more remote places? And I think that's one of the big challenges that Hawaii has, and one of the issues that we'll be exploring.
Do you see any significant interaction and overlap between our K-12 public education system and the University of Hawaii in terms of discussing things together, having joint briefings or anything like that, or are they just so completely different worlds they don't talk to each other?
I'm sure there's some talking that goes on now just because of the, was it 55 by 25? But I'm not sure how much coordination happens between them. It's maybe something to take a look at. Yeah. You're giving me some story ideas here.
Oh, okay, good. Oh, I have some more. No.
Oh, yeah, well.
Yeah, so, people have commented, particularly in K-12 education, that in spite of all the information and data and experiences people have, that often, maybe it's because of the task, schools and leaders in education are notoriously not interested in what other education people are doing. If somebody has an innovative program, they are not bombarded with inquiries. Have you found that to be true? Have you found that the world of education is bubbling with curiosity about all the different parts, or just so honed in on, I got to get my kids past this test?
Yeah. So I think it depends. I mean, there's been so much focus on tests, and that's not new. I cover education occasionally for a national publication called District Administration. And we look at a lot of programs that are pretty innovative in terms of, I did a story about school districts that are going completely open source. So creating all of their textbooks and a lot of their curriculum material through programs where you can access it online, change it instantly. You're not paying that money anymore. You're involving teachers more and making them more in charge of curriculum. And a lot of the districts that I talk to for programs like this are bombarded by other districts saying, how do I do this? How can I do this? But maybe more for programs where there's a financial incentive. So there's a financial incentive to having free curriculum, or in some ways, back under No Child Left Behind, there might have been some serious incentives for needing to raise that test score and reaching out to districts that were having success in certain areas. So I think there is some of that, but how much room and ability each school here in Hawaii has to really innovate and start new programs and do that, well, we'll add that to the list of questions I'll be exploring.
We are a heavily unionized state. And even the faculty belongs to a union. Has this been a new realm for you in some respect, coming from a state where it's not necessarily as
California is pretty union heavy as well. So there are a lot of unions in California, and they do hold a significant amount of sway.
So not that big a difference.
Not that huge of a difference, though. I think going back to the issue of size, the difference is, Anaheim School District has a union, and other individual districts have a union. So if you're not getting information from one union, you can talk to another union, and there are opportunities for developing lots of different sources. Whereas here, it's you reach out to one board, one union, one university. If you don't get the information you need, it becomes a little bit more challenging.
Well, thank you very, very much. One of the few investigative reporters in any field in Hawaii, Jessica Terrell with civilbeat.com.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, thanks for coming. And thanks for all of you who have looked at and seen our Think Tech Hawaii interviews for movers, shakers, and reformers. This is our 30th interview. It's kind of a package, and you will find that through these interviews, an awful lot of information and insight can be found on education from preschool all through adult education. Aloha.